Um, let's just start off with modern enterprise, right? What do we think what that is, right? So I think first of all, obviously, lots of folks are still deep in their cloud transformations, right? So that's a big part of modernization. A lot of folks are obviously multi-cloud. The other, I think, piece of modern is speed. We heard about this a bit, right? But I mean, modern delivery, DevOps, that's where this is going, and speed is in that respect very important. I think another element which really touches our role as well is another element of, I think, the modern enterprise is they've broken through their organizational silos in a way, right? It's leveraging a third-party ecosystem. It's leveraging a service provider ecosystem, of which we are often one as well, right? So I think that modernization is a good context what folks are doing, and often driven by not just wanting to serve their clients better, but also cost optimization type of things. We'll talk a little bit about that in this one. So what I want to talk about is, I think, the core problem that Vulcan, obviously in your origin story and what you guys are trying to do is what we see as well, right? There is this ongoing, and it's still ongoing, an imbalance between find and fix. I've been fascinated by this piece particularly, because I mean, it seems so obvious to, hey, we have a problem somewhere, we are actually able to find it. Why can't we fix it speedily enough? And more often than not, it actually has nothing to do with technology, but it has to do with things like governance and just people collaborating, right? So this is very much a transformation that folks are in. So we're going to talk a little bit about those silos and why it's sometimes difficult to break through. Obviously, this year, budget crunch, I think it's real. We've heard Yaniv talk about tools consolidation, tools optimization. And that's an interesting paradox here, right? Because we're seeing the same thing, obviously, with our clients, but we're adding Vulcan in the mix as an integration mechanism, right? So in a way, we're adding something to make the rest work better. So there's a bit of a paradox there, but I think explainable. So a little bit about me. You could probably hear my accent. I'm Dutch. I live actually in the US. I've split my career across a startup. I was a product manager at an MSSP and spent the last 20 years at the Big Four firm. And really over those, particularly the past 10 years, I typically look at 2012 as a pivotal year. All kinds of crucial things happened. The Target breach, Saudi Aramco. I hope I have the year correct if somebody's Googling. But I feel that was a watershed moment in how corporations and boards really starting to take the threat landscape serious. And that's where you can really see a lot of, right now, well-known companies starting out, right? I joined Wipro in January, so I'm almost hitting a year. And I was happy to learn that Wipro was an early investor in Vulcan. So when Yaniv, when we met, I couldn't have imagined that we would be working a couple of years later so closely together. Wipro is an early investor. We have a ventures arm. We do strategic investments in early stage companies. And funny enough, we're talking about the shift from vulnerability management to exposure management. And if we kind of loosely define that category, we actually have 3 out of 5 live ventures that play in that field. We've integrated Vulcan with our vulnerability management as a service solution, which we've based on Qualys. And we have, particularly this year, really aggressively gone to market, and we're socializing and we're embedding Vulcan, particularly in our large-scale IT outsourcing RFP responses. And that's really the interesting, I think, part of the reason why I joined Wipro is, as a managed services provider, as a system integrator, you actually have deep insights in a lot of IT environments of clients. And what's interesting there is a lot of clients expect that managing that IT is inherently secure. We're all in this world of, hey, we have security, we have scanners, we need remediation. But from that lens, there is actually an expectation that the vulnerability management is embedded in IT management. So that's, I think, the what I love about working at Wipro in this context is that these worlds come together. You can read about our research of this ongoing imbalance between find and fix. We have an annual cybersecurity report, and this came out in this area. I find it interesting because when I first saw the results, I actually thought that vulnerability scanning wasn't that much of a problem. But it's really what Yaniv or Ricard said earlier. It's that operational burden. It is indeed, folks have multiple scanners. And sometimes these multiple scanners come out of also business reasons, M&A. So this complexity around the scanning is actually much larger or predominant than I had figured, right? And that's obviously what we do with our vulnerability management as a service. We try to lighten that operational burden. The asset identification, which is seen as the biggest challenge, well, that's basically what we've talked about so far quite a bit, right? The rapidly evolving, ever-evolving attack surface, OT, IoT, cloud, and IT is just difficulty keeping up. Obviously, still the whole kind of shadow IT with the business. I've not worked with a client where there is a huge CMDB health concern, right? Where there's also programs around improving the health of the CMDB, deeply rooted in IT, working with the business. But ultimately, the risk analysis and the prioritization is what Vulcan plays in. And to me, what's fascinating there is this is where the translation happens, right? I mean, ultimately, if you really double click, if you really go under the hood of output of scanning, it's still very deeply technical information. And so translating that to actual risk is harder than what you would think. How I interpret the right side of this analysis is once you actually have the ducks in a row of, hey, look, these are the assets, these are the vulnerabilities, this is how you should prioritize, maybe using threat intel, using mechanisms to really understand, hey, is this vulnerability actually being exploited? Then IT actually knows what to do. But there's this whole prelude to actually getting that done, right? So that's still setting the scene there. So what happens here is, and I talked about this, is that often, and very curious what the subsequent speakers will say about this. In my time at a big four firm, the hardest part of these projects actually were not the integrations. They were not. It was getting the governance sorted. So I think there is still a bit of a frenemies concept or a frenemies construct in a lot of clients, because literally, if you look on the right side of this slide, these teams are really living in their own worlds, and they have already their hands full in those worlds, right? So ultimately, when you embark on a project with a Vulcan and trying to get this process end-to-end better organized, you're going to have to break through organizational silos. This maybe sounds like something pretty obvious, but this is a leadership challenge. This is where a CIO and a CISO and risk and audit really need to come together and find that kind of shared accountability model, right? So IT really, really struggles, as I said, with the asset visibility. What you've seen happening, and I love, Yaniv, how you've put it on your slide as well, is, well, then cyber says, well, let's just make our own inventory, right? That's where the cyber asset management kind of companies came from, right? With some also launched during the RSA sandbox, right? So there's a little bit of things going on where, hey, look, if we can't rely on IT, we'll do it ourselves. But and then security and IT do the same thing. So really breaking through that, I think, sets the successful programs apart from the folks that are struggling more. When I in this list talk about service provider management and governance, I mean, that's where the other part of the complexity comes from, right? Because in a lot of cases, and you can talk about things like skill shortage, right? The teams that are doing this are under pressure. And so lots of times, I mean, for me, it's been fascinating this year seeing all these integrated IT outsourcing RFPs, right? But that is where you do introduce a dependency and where you have to actually work together in that ecosystem. The other thing which I find fascinating, and we talk about the imbalance between find and fix, but we're going to have to put more in focus the role of risk and compliance, right? And maybe that's my bias, having spent 20 years with a big four firm, but the risk acceptances are being abused in a lot of times, right? So it is not just that backlog of vulnerabilities that I would worry about, right? That Ricard talked about, but it's also lingering vulnerabilities that have been risk accepted and that we have difficulty tracking when we need to revisit them because something's going on in the threat landscape that makes them relevant again, right? So breaking through these three worlds is actually what makes these programs, I think, very interesting. But the collaboration really needs to happen here, and this is where this topic really becomes a team sport. Okay, moving on, and Yaniv, I hope to give you back at least a minute or so. So if I look at particularly this year, I do think the budget crunch is real, right? You talk about tool proliferation, having actually multiple similar tools doing the same thing. I mean, the CISOs of this world in modern enterprises are becoming way more business oriented. I think that's also why you see the rise of cyber risk quantification happening right now. So, I mean, we are really getting to a context where this is much more a business discussion, much more an ROI discussion. And that's I feel still challenging, right? Because you're still translating a very technical domain into risk alignment with the business. So what we see is as part of strategies for optimizing the cost here, we talked a little bit about changing operating models, right? These three teams need to work together. But this is where we feel Vulcan is in the sweet spot of particularly process optimization and automation, right? There is a clear case, and I haven't included AI in this, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit about it on the roadmap piece of this summit. But I mean, the automation opportunities are abundant here. I will say that one of where we see this work is you have to actually really have a good process understanding and description, and so not automate for automate's sake. But in this kind of context of teams, collaboration, the business lens, I think this is where Vulcan is in its sweet spot. And obviously, we think as a managed service provider that we play a role in basically when Ricard talked about, hey, RFP, we have a client that wants these 6, 7 things in one tool. Yeah, I agree that one tool doesn't exist. But that's what the service provider lens is, right? Because obviously folks like us and also others are bundling these in services, right? Which makes also the cost more predictable for consumption. So I think there's this whole play here. Just to end quickly, a joint customer case that I'm very proud of, and we cannot name the client just yet. We're in the final go live phases, but hopefully, Gal, next summit, we can go a little bit deeper. But this is a client where we help them really transform the broader cyber defense capability. So not just vulnerability management, but also security operations, incident response, those kind of things. But the vulnerability piece is front and center because what drove this part of the program is really get line of sight of ROI and really get a better reporting around the vulnerabilities. And then if you look on the right side, there's multiple integrations here. And when I heard you guys talk about the shift from vulnerability management to exposure management, in a way, and we haven't called it that in the program, but basically this is covering or starting to cover that whole broad set of use cases around exposure management. I will say the ServiceNow angle, where I see success with clients is that there's typically a parallel ServiceNow project around CMDB improvements, or things like having a really good view. The name of the module just escapes me. Having a real good view on how the different infrastructure components actually lead up to the criticality of a business app. That's where I see a lot of success. And I've also seen where clients are actually now realizing that a scanner like Qualys can actually really help enrich that CMDB, right? So this is another example of how security in IT can kind of break through that frenemies situation and really realize that they can work effectively together.